Welcome everyone, and this is a follow-up Q&A to the talk you gave at the Lieberhume Center for the Future of Intelligence conference. We had some technical issues, unfortunately, there, but good thing mainly my talk was affected by that. I could re-upload it, and I have done so. And this is the first video I'm going to make after the uploads of that conference. And I'd like to just start right off and ask you once again, what do you mean when you use the term profilicity?
Yes, that's a term Paul D'Ambrosio and I developed in our book, You and Your Profile, Identity After Authenticity. And it's supposed to identify, or it's a word for an identity technology, what we call identity technology. So to put this short, the basic idea is, in this we follow Lionel, literary critic basically, but he had like a whole theory of authenticity and sincerity. So sincerity means that you shape your identity by an orientation towards social roles in traditional society. So this would be typically roles in the family, but can also be roles basically that you're either born into, for instance, because of the stratum you're born into, whatever, you're an aristocrat, or the profession you're born into, because most professions traditionally people were also born into, right? So basically you have a number of roles, more or less by birth, and then you sincerely commit to them, and thereby you shape an identity, and this is also the identity by which you basically identify yourself, and other people identify you by that as your kind of prime identity. And then already according to Trilling, but also to others like Charles Taylor, this changes in modernity. And then you're no longer really born into roles, but you're supposed to find your identity or develop your identity, because this is kind of an individualist approach where everyone is supposed to be unique and original. So the identity is no longer something that you sincerely commit to, but that you're sort of to authentically develop and authentically express. That's your kind of inner self. That is the basis for this authenticity mode of developing an identity. And then if other people really want to know who you are, they have to know basically your inner self somehow. And we argue that this changes in modernity, and then we, not in modernity, that this changed recently, the past few decades or so, that people switched to another mode of identity, namely profilicity, and that's oriented to a profile. So profiles are basically, we know the term from social media, that's where we took it from, where you basically create a profile, you present it for social validation, you curate it, and then it gets validated and you get invested in it. And this is then something that you identify with and that others identify you by. And we argue that this is increasingly the dominating or the dominant mode of forming and shaping an identity. And that's profile orientation in identity shaping.
Okay, and would you say this form of profilicity is a Western cultural phenomenon? And if so, has it existed before social media?
It's not really culture bound, but of course, I think actually, like I live and work in Macau, China, right? That in China specifically and in East Asia in general, there has been a very smooth transition from sincerity to profilicity, because the mode of authenticity wasn't that much developed. So the sincerity model, and I guess that's maybe, you have also a kind of Asian, I understand, Middle Eastern cultural background. So in many non-Western societies, the sincerity mode has been, or is still quite prevalent. So I wouldn't say it's necessarily an Asian thing, but this has to do with all kinds of, I guess, factors, not only cultural, but economic factors, technological development factors, and so forth. that there was this transition, more or less directly from sincerity to profilicity. So I do not think, to go back to your question, that profilicity is a specifically Western thing, but in all those places, specifically most Western places, where there's a strong authenticity, where the age of authenticity was particularly strong, the path toward profilicity is different and maybe even more difficult. I think generally my experience here in China is that because because of the certain parallels between sincerity and authenticity, that they're kind of both reputation based, that they're based on presenting a self to the outside, and the orientation is to the role or the profile, which is more like something external, and it's not so much to this supposed inner self. That this transition can be somehow more smooth if you don't have, let's say, the baggage of authenticity in this to the same extent as strong authenticity-based places. But again, I would hesitate to use the term culture there.
Okay, but would you say that authenticity in a way is connected to individualism in a sense, which wasn't developed in such a way in non-Western cultures? And
absolutely.
Sincerity is more let's say a symptom of a more traditionalist society.
Absolutely.
In a way.
Yes.
Okay, interesting. So we've got three terms now. We've got profilicity, we've got authenticity, and we've got sincerity, right?
Right.
And authenticity appears to be some sort of maybe preliminary stage to what came before profilicity made its rise in the West.
Authenticity, yes, was prior to profilicity, yes.
Okay.
And basically, we're all still children of the age of authenticity. It's still very powerful.
Okay, and how would you say? So, would you say that in Chinese culture or in Chinese society, is identity defined in a different way as they've arrived at profilicity as well, but they've arrived to it from a different origin?
Right, because the sincerity mode is until today very strong in Chinese society, which has a lot to do with the Confucian heritage.
Okay, and how does that express itself? How is the profilicity different to the profilicity in the West?
Again, these are very general questions, so I cannot really answer them very precisely. I don't think it is very different. I think it's actually very similar. And I'm sorry for repeating myself. It's just that in the West, there is this kind of strong, let's say, prejudice against profilicity because it is, as a matter of fact, non-authentic. And therefore, it is often described and regarded as inauthentic from the perspective of authenticity. And that's, I think, the difference, that in places like China, where the authenticity paradigm, let's say, wasn't that strong, profilicity is neither perceived nor described very much as inauthentic.
Okay.
And that's the difference.
Okay. So would you say that
people have less of a problem? Like, I give you an example. I was listening a few months ago to a talk by basically some person from advertising from Beijing, younger woman. And she was talking about authenticity in marketing, and that you have to shape a brand that looks authentic. But she was describing it like it's basically a Western, and all the Westerners in the audience said, yeah, but that's a total sellout of authenticity, right? You're not, branding is the opposite of authenticity. And the Westerners in the audience immediately had that reaction, which the presenter herself didn't feel. She simply thought, okay, if I succeed in branding a product as somehow grassroots, even though it's like a totally curated profile, which she totally knows, then for her, that's not really inauthentic. People nowadays use the term authentic in this way, right? You have to have an authentic profile, which is, of course, a contradiction in terms. I also read this in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung recently. There was like a report about the top 10 influencers in Germany, like on YouTube and Instagram. And again, it is Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. And the report said, oh, the key to their success is authenticity, which is, of course, ridiculous, right? And then she described in the report what she meant, like, oh, they create a profile that is kind of consistent, right? They only sell products that fit their image. They only advertise, and they create this consistent look and feel. This was literally what was said, right? So that's pure profilicity work. And
another thing I may add.
Even this, sorry for interrupting, even this author in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung in Germany didn't notice the inauthenticity that he was describing inauthenticity. So I'm kind of correcting myself, right? So it also happens in Germany, even in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. But I think in Europe, it's happened still somehow less than it happens in Asia, where it's kind of the standard thing. They don't even understand that it's a kind of contradiction in terms.
I see what you mean. So what I kind of get from this is the influencers that are seen the most authentic are those who, for example, live stream their Christmas and their children unpacking their toys and their holidays and their breakups and their their all of their private life is being published, and especially it's probably not even a lie. Like they probably actually broke up, right? They probably actually got back together.
It's not, and that's totally correct, Sean. It's not a lie. Profilicity is not more a lie than authenticity or sincerity. None of them is a lie, because you, just as in sincerity, people commit to the role, and eventually they honestly live up to the role. Right. And the same, so the honesty in sincerity, or the truthfulness and authenticity, or what we call the true investment in profilicity, is something you develop by doing it.
Right. That, I gotta say, that reminds me a bit actually of the book here. I'm sure you've probably heard of it. Baudrillard's Simulacrum.
Sure, of course. That's very central to our whole theoretical approach, of course.
Oh yeah, right. That's great. Yes. I've read it, I think, 2 years ago, and
we briefly talk about Baudrillard. We have a short section in the book.
Oh, really? Okay. I really have got to order that book, and I will. And I will read it until our next talk. And, yeah. So it reminds me of this notion of how do you say, that the real has been kind of replaced by simulations.
The hyperreal.
Oh yeah, of the hyperreal, simulations of something that's not there anymore.
Right.
And in that sense, somehow
that was never there. That's the whole point in that sense, right? The simulacrum is a copy of without an original.
Right, I see. I wonder just if I, for example, live stream my Christmas, live stream my day, my breakups and everything, I change the way they happen, right? I change, they become a show. People change their
something
behavior.
Completely different.
Yeah, my Christmas again, is going to be different if I film it.
It's already, Walter Benjamin describes it, which is in his famous book on, famous essay on art in the time of technological reproduction. And basically, look, you have movies. That's what he's talking about. There is no longer an original, like different from painting. And now, similar with the live stream, everything is already copied, and it exists only in the mode of this performance. So it's not really
that there is first the original and then the copy, just like in the movie. It is already done in the mode of something that is a curated image. So it's not a curated image of something that exists as an uncurated original in the first place. Everything is already done in the mode of the profile curation.
Would you say that this development is essentially destructive? Like, would you say it is something that you say poses an existential risk to an extent, as a kind of more deeper understanding of technological encroachment on our lives?
Not really. I mean, that's the standard approach to it, and including Baudrillard, whom you just mentioned. Baudrillard is nostalgic for authenticity. So the typical attitude from Heidegger to Baudrillard, until even more contemporary like Byung-Chul Han, they all have this authenticity nostalgia. And they think somehow, you know, there's a loss of the real, a loss of reality, a loss of the authentic. And I don't buy that, because I think the authentic has never been really authentic. I think just as that their authenticity, just as sincerity, has been a construct, right? You learn to be authentic by learning how to be authentic from others. You mold yourself into the mode of authenticity that you learn from books, from movies, from your culture around you. So it's not different from sincerity. So I think authenticity, even though it works, just like in sincerity, Sean, right? Whatever the idea of the woman in sincerity, or of the man in sincerity, you come from a culture, you know these images, right? And I think they're also, of course, in these cultures, like in Chinese culture, there is the idea that is the nature of women, or this is how God made women or men, if you have a notion of a God. But in China, then you have the idea still that this is how the natural order of things is. And so there is this idea that by living up to the role, you're finding true manhood, or you're finding true femininity. And of course, that's not true. It's a total social construct. But similarly, if you try to find your true self, that's a similar illusion. The true self also doesn't exist. It's a similar kind of a cultural construct that you set up, and that works. Just as in traditional cultures, you can build up a society, you can build up an identity. But in fact, I think we are all, human existence is hopelessly incongruent. It's hopelessly multifarious. From a Buddhist Taoist perspective, you can say it's empty. But we use these technologies, sincerity, authenticity, or now profilicity, to mold this multifarious incongruity, which we are, into an identity, and we must do it. And each of these three technologies works well. And none of them is true, but each of them yet works well, and thereby is also not false.
Works well in respect to which value? Works well in, yeah.
Well, works well in basically, what is this? Squaring the circle.
Right.
That they manage to combine all these different sectors of human existence. I have this background in Niklas Luhmann systems theory. So basically three systemic realms: the bodily realm, the mental realm, and the social realm. And all of them function according to their own autopoietic procedures, whatever. The body lives, right?
Right.
And the mind develops as a psychological kind of entity. And then there is society, which through social evolution develops. And so there is no correlation between that, basically. And you have to combine all these different elements of your existence, your completely contingent body, right? Your completely kind of equally contingent mental experience, mental self, and the society that, to use Heideggerian term, you've been thrown into. And then you have to bring all this together and somehow say, this is me. I have, this body is my body. These thoughts are my thoughts. This degree that I had made last week is mine, right? And that's what identity does. So that you're basically capable of identifying this kind of mass of contingency, which little children can't do. You have to learn it. You're not born with an identity, right? You have to learn that. And in order to learn this, and in order for society to practice this, it's like it's a very complex social practice. I mean, like 5,000 years ago, people wouldn't identify in the way people identify now. Identity was, as far as we can tell, much, much less complex.
Okay, I'll try and formulate a kind of pushback to this in a way, because I would say, wouldn't you need at least some basis of a real, of a foundation, in order to like function and recognize yourself in a world?
But all these things are real, Sean. Your body is very real. Your mind is very real. Society is very real. The point is that the identity is something that isn't obvious and that isn't really there. You don't have a soul. In traditional, I would say the soul is not real. Sorry, I don't know if it's
in the Platonic sense. Okay.
Yeah, or in any religious sense, right? So that was kind of the first kind of notion that would somehow propose something like an identity. But we don't have a soul.
Would you not say, in the, let's say, Heideggerian sense, again, to bring that up again, that there is a mode of being thrown back at your own authentic selfness, das eigentliche Selbstsein, when you're in a stage of anxiety, in a way, this paradoxical notion of once you look into the void, once you do away with any preconceptions and do away, once you become Zen or Tao or whatever, there's probably equivalent Eastern notions of this.
That's wrong, Sean. I have to say that's wrong. The Eastern notion, which is where our whole philosophy comes from, especially from Taoism, what you then see is that there is emptiness, that there is no self. That's the core of both Taoist and Buddhist insight, and that's, I mean, our philosophy is in a way a contemporary, very contemporary form of Taoism. So that is precisely not what Heidegger's point.
Well, it's empty, but I'd say it's contradictory in a sense. Well, because facing this emptiness leads to a thrown back, or it leads to a considering, or a sense that comes through in a way that can only come through in this particular Dasein, in this particular mode.
Of course, that's you're presenting the Heideggerian narrative, which is one of the master narratives of authenticity, very well. And I just don't buy it. I think, even that, I mean, we refer to Heidegger, like you look at Heidegger, Sean, you read Heidegger's book. Because you read Heidegger's book, you now believe that what you've learned there is your authentic self. So you've learned this mode of identifying yourself, authentic self, simply in a very inauthentic way. You didn't learn it the way Heidegger told you learned it. You actually learned it by reading Heidegger.
Well, I mean, that's the first step, isn't it? It's like it's a first step towards trying to attempt to live more in tune with your Dasein, in a sense, right? Like it's a.
Well, I mean, I'm not, of course, denying that there are these deep, intense experiences. I'm not denying that they are very, whatever, wonderful or important or constitutive of being human, not denying all of that, or not denying any of that. The point is that there is no congruity in them. There is no essentiality in them. They are temporal experience contingently through numerous uncorrelated and uncorrelatable factors that are momentary achieved. They're no more essential than whatever when you play football and you score a goal, and you also have a very kind of a great feeling of selfhood. But that's a very kind of different form. And again, people will also tell these stories about finding maybe their true self in the mode of authenticity, again, in the mode of sincerity. Whatever, if you have traditional, maybe again, like for instance, Confucian or Islamic descriptions of selfhood, or to the Confucian ones, they will always refer to whatever the family feelings, the intense family feelings. In Confucianism, the mourning for your parents is like the existential moment where your true identity comes to the fore, because then you really experience, which is of course also real, then you really experience your emotional attachment to your parents and your complete existential connection with them. And that is from a Confucian perspective, an equally intensely experience of selfhood. And I think it's equally, I'm not saying authenticity is not valid. I grew up, I experience my own identity in the same way as you describe Heidegger. I just can distance myself theoretically and see the contingency of that.
See, I don't know if this distancing is authentic.
No, of course it's not authentic.
No, but the point I'm making is, I'd say, if it's all real, as you say, if it's real, the culture of sincerity you grew up in, or the sense of belongingness that you get from all that, if all these things are real, then I'd say I'd say it's a paradoxical notion. All identities are paradoxical, but that doesn't mean that they're not real. It means I fully agree with you that the kind of the ideality of some sort of separate, eternal and consistent sort of identity or soul, that doesn't hold up. I would agree with you there. But this, I mean, especially as I'm not very familiar with Eastern work. I actually just recently read some stuff, but I have to admit, I don't think, without knowing Chinese and without knowing any of the languages, I don't think I get any good understanding of it. But I get the sense that it is something contradictory. So in a way, you denying some sort of identity is something that grew out of you growing up from an authenticity-based culture, yes, and then moving to one that is not authenticity-based. And this is something.
I'm not denying identity, Sean. I'm not denying it. Saying it is essential for who we are. I'm just saying it is a construct, but a construct that is very, very real, and that is super important. And we have, in this sense, you can be your authentic self, and I actually am my authentic self, but it is not more true than a sincere self or a prophilic self.
Would you say that in terms of reality, there's no difference between those three? Or would you say there is some sort of asymmetry between authenticity, profilicity, and sincerity in some way?
No, because that's what I said when I said I think they work equally well. Then what I mean, maybe in your more existential language, that they have the same degree of existential validity.
I can see that between authenticity and sincerity. just I feel sometimes that profilicity, there's an asymmetry with profilicity because it is something
Yes.
historically unique or recent.
Yes.
And in a sense, it's something, it more seems like the algorithms are like, they're feeding off of your authentic personality and turning it into profilicity. I sometimes
Yes.
get that
You have to
impression.
go back to Baudrillard and this kind of thinking to see that how this is real. Like my favorite example is the brand. Right?
Right, yeah.
The brand is a profile of a commodity, something
Mm-hmm.
that's sold on the market.
Yeah.
And in the past, there were
like
only
your favorite company.
Yes, exactly. In the past, there were, for that matter, in the past, there were also only phones. I don't know if you remember that, but I still grew up with landline phones. And as far, they might have a manufacturer, but they weren't really branded. You would just have a phone. No one would say, I have, and then it's a brand thing. So there were things. Nowadays, we no longer see a phone. The Apple that you showed me, the Mac, that is very real. That's a profile. And that the Apple is in that sense more real, more intense than the actual phone as the identity of that thing, right? Or otherwise, put in, if you would take away the Apple or the Mac, you would feel there's something lacking. So the full reality of that phone, as it is with most commodities nowadays, is only there. The identity, that then the phone only has an identity, otherwise it doesn't really have an identity. All right. And I think we are, as people, as individuals, as humans, we are following exactly that model. And I think in many ways we've already reached that stage. Where, and this is again, and of course it gets theoretically more complicated. This is second order observation, the switch to second order observation, because we're living in a world which is entirely built on second order observation. Idea comes from Luhmann, right? So again, and the economy is the best thing, right? Something has a value, a monetary value, because you can, the price of something is something that's established on the market, not in the thing itself. So the market is how something is observed. So everything, once we think in terms of prices, once we think in terms of value, in the contemporary sense, we're already thinking in terms of second order observation. And then the brand is tied to that. And again, I think just as we treat things in this way, we're increasingly also treating a human identity in exactly this way. Again,
Okay.
This is similar to the traditional reputation with the role thing, but there are many differences as well.
I take it from your videos that some of the influence, at least that you've mentioned, is Nietzschean in a way, which is
sure.
Which brings me to ask a question based on some authors that I liked that have been influenced by Nietzsche. First of all, there is this notion by Carl Gustav Jung, taken from Nietzsche, of there being an ego and a self. And the self is not seen as this sort of identity or something. The self is something that is essentially something that cannot be mapped or described in a sense. And the ego is the kind of conceptualization of the self. It's an attempt of building an idol of that self. And
right.
It is essential in a sense to know that the ego is constructed, that it is constructed. But for development, for, let's say, individuation, it is somehow necessary to try and strive for a more coherent image of the self for constructing the ego. So it is something like a necessary transcendent object, in a way that almost, it's probably a terrible comparison talking to a philosophy professor, but I mean, in a way that, like, in Kant's, justifying Kant's morality, you kind of have this necessary transcendent figure of God, in a sense, Otherwise,
Okay.
the entire process doesn't work. I don't. This is probably a
Right.
terrible comparison,
Right.
but you
No,
get
no,
the
it's
sense.
totally fine. I don't know Jung that well, but it seems to me, just as with maybe therefore actually the Kant example is kind of a good example, that I mean Jung is also a psychologist, right? That these that they do not take into account sufficiently the social aspect of selfhood, or that they kind of devalue it, like also with Freud, right? Yeah, I think that this kind of social element of the self, your persona, again, your role, and that this is equally powerful, and that this, I think the Jungian model, like many models of many, not naturally, many psychologists, they are psychological reductionists.
Mhm.
They reduce selfhood very much to psychological phenomena. Now, again, I'm not saying the phenomena are not there. They are there, and they're very important, but they are not primary. They have no primacy over the social aspects of selfhood. They are all, and again, this is Luhmann systems theory, they're in each other's environment, but none of them is central. It's a system environment approach. So
Well,
it's not the case. Sorry for again talking too much.
No
I
problem.
don't see the psychological element of selfhood as the central element of selfhood.
Yes, well, I wouldn't argue more about this, but I would just say that in Jung's case, I see his separation from Freud as a move towards a more collective model. Like, so for him, the unconscious is the collective unconscious, as opposed to Freud's just personal unconscious. And the ego is something that, of which one part is the persona, which is something that is socially constructed, and the other part is the shadow, which is that which lies in the unconscious, which is which is part of the ego, but the ego usually denies. So the shadow is that which comes out when someone who thinks of themselves as a pacifist loses their temper and attacks people, for example.
Right.
Yes. That's that point, but that I wouldn't want to elaborate further on that. Another point, another person that was very influenced by Nietzsche that I came to my mind is Oswald Spengler, who was talking about cycles of civilization, and especially he had a work focusing on technology. They mentioned die Technik, I think was called.
Yeah, I never read Spengler, I have to say, but I know of him. Yes.
Right, so right. And for him, technology was a sense of slow collapse process, a process of slow collapse in a big cycle that has been started with the Greeks. And it is as Heidegger would also say, that technics has become the end of metaphysics. In a way, even if I'd just say you disagree with Heidegger's sense of authenticity, but it does mirror what you say in one of your videos on the necessity of a second enlightenment when it came to Kant. I think it was a video on Kant you made, where there's this point that technics has become the end point of metaphysics. There's a Hegel scholar Gotthard Günther, who talks about this as well, that there is this kind of cycle that has come to an end. It is this transition. You could say maybe something like that happened in India when going from Hinduism to Buddhism. Buddhism is this where all these different gods have been exposed as empty faces, and you're just left with the flame to extinguish. In the same sense, would you say that, like, perhaps the profilicity, as it's becoming, would you say profilicity would at least have some sense of more emptiness, in a sense that it's a identity in the process of degradation, in the process of let's say disintegration?
Again, I want to be neutral towards profilicity. I'm not a big fan of it, in a sense. I'm not saying it's in any kind of objective way better than the others, and I'm not enjoying it, right? Because I grew up in authenticity, and it's what I'm used to.
Right.
But again, yes, it is much more let's say, multiple, of course, than authenticity, right? But in this sense, and this brings us to the technology question, it fits more to the present day age with all the different technologies, but also, like, again, coming from Luhmann, first of all, the social differentiation, that there are all these different social function systems, right, that we exist in, and they are no longer like directly correlated, right? You switch jobs, and your family status doesn't determine your gender, and your family status is not connected with your job directly, and so forth, and can change constantly. And you don't lose your job because you get divorced or something like this, right? And then there are all these other systems in which you have to function, whatever you have to function as a mass media consumer, as in a political, as somehow a political person. You have to function economically, you have to function legally, and you function in sports, you function whatever in, you know, pop culture with what music you listen to, and there's no correlation between all of these, and it's futile to try to correlate it. So simply put, you need a different profile for all of these different areas. It works much better, right? You can be whatever, a PhD student during the day, a DJ at night. Then you can go to your football team and play football. And then whatever, you have a relationship and you have a family, and you have somehow a different profile in each of these realms. And that's nothing bad. That's, you shouldn't regard it as necessarily a loss of authenticity.
Okay.
That's somehow to an extent that's liberating. Again,
Yes.
I don't want to idealize this, but to an extent, this is just as liberating as at the moment of the rise of authenticity. You could be liberated from your roles. It was no longer that, you know, your gender role, your professional role would define you as who you are. That's a big liberation. Now, in a sense, this kind of, and I experience is that you always have to be the same, right? And that is also an unrealistic great pressure. Like you mentioned, we're not always all the same, and it's good that we're not. We are multitudes, right? And that we have the capacity, not in a dishonest way, but to sort of explore different profiles and develop different profiles, and be invested in truly invested in different profiles in different contexts. And I'm not saying that's necessarily better, but I'm also saying it's not necessarily worse. And again, it has a lot to do with technology, right? I cannot act in the same way as a customer at my bank. I loathe it. I don't like it, right? I have to go there on Monday to the bank and talk to this bank person. But it's a different profile that I have. And other people like that. Right? And I have to dissociate myself from all these other profiles, and I have to somehow be truly invested into my profile as somehow a customer, or in my financial profile of this bank, and so forth. And otherwise I couldn't function. It doesn't help me to seek my authentic self in my bank customer profile. It isn't there.
Okay, well, I mean, I would add to this that, like, looking at things like civilizational cycles going up and down, it doesn't necessarily have to be like I'm passing a value judgment on something, and that we need to stop profilicity or whatever. I would just say that, like, if you look at profilicity in that way as you just did, it makes sense, especially because, yeah, it's hard to disagree that, like, we are somehow composite beings in a sense, and that, like, there's many aspects to us. I would say there is this paradox though of centralization and decentralization. Somehow this, like, you know, what they call the coincidence of opposites in some philosophies, where I'd say as soon as you have a lot of decentralization, in order for this to be kind of held together,
Right.
There needs to be some centralization. So, for example, there's this, if you look at political theories, there's this paradox where if you go libertarian or anarchist, more further and further anarchist and libertarian, you end up becoming a monarchist. You know what I mean? Like it's the sense that like the best system is a king that does almost nothing, but there still is a king. You know what I mean? And so I'm wondering that, like, at least as in, let's say, a transcendental object, that there is a need to have at least this this unity to at least strive for, even if it's something that doesn't exist, if it's something that motivates you, or that is something that somehow is tangential to your actions, then it is something to at least recognize and contend with. And otherwise you end up with what Deleuze, I don't know if you're familiar with Deleuze, calls a sort of kind of total schizophrenia of identity,
of course, yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Which is also something, I think, if it's just dissociating and just multiplicity, it's also something that isn't necessarily wanted, right? It's not necessarily something to be desired, if it's purely schizophrenic in a sense, you know?
Yeah, I wouldn't call it, I think you have a good point, and I should think more about this. Again, I think like in the past, when you had the sincerity, when you also always had a multiplicity of roles, father, son, husband, grandfather, friend, and all of these things, right? And there could also be, and were often also, conflicts between these roles. So we are kind of used to live with a multiplicity of roles, and this didn't lead to schizophrenia, and to the contrary. And I think something similar is also possible with profilicity. Like in Taoism, my beginnings in Taoism, I was specifically fascinated, or my whole approach to Taoist philosophy was through chapter 11 of the Tao Te Ching, the Lao Tzu, which has this image of the wheel with the empty hub that is the center of all the spokes, right?
Yes, I was thinking of this, yes.
Yeah, 11 spokes or 13 spokes unite in one hub, and the hub is empty. It's at the end. It's the center of the wheel is empty. And I think we have something similar in profilicity. So we have all these different spokes of the wheel, and the center is empty, and yet it somehow is where everything sort of that holds everything together. And that is something I think we can, and again, that's a kind of a Taoist way of thinking of profilicity, which is again different from the authenticity thing. My friend and colleague, I often refer to him, unfortunately passed away a few years ago, Henry Rosemont. He has these two models. He doesn't use the terminology, but he says like basically the role, the sincerity person is like an onion with all these different layers of the onion, but there's also not really a core. And then you have the authenticity, and again, he doesn't use this word, but he used the metaphor of the peach with a strong pit, right? And only the hard pit is like the real thing, and then around is a kind of soft. And again, then I would say that then if we go to profilicity, we have the wheel with the empty center and all these spokes which point into different directions, and not like the onion are this kind of organically layered thing, but somehow it's like they point in all kinds of different directions. But the same thing again, like with sincerity, which is another parallel, is the emptiness of the center.
That's interesting. And I think your time is up, right? Almost.
Time, it might be up, yes. Yeah.
Yes, but
is
I think
okay?
I think it's a very nice point to end with. I may do also a short follow-up on my own reflecting on this.
Sure.
And
yes.
maybe you'd be
And
interested in
again, like we can, I think an hour is a good length. I think otherwise it's also maybe too long for listeners.
Yeah.
And if you want to do like a follow-up conversation, I'd be happy to do that as well.
Very glad. I really enjoy back and forths like this. And
yes, it was good. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Georg. And how do
Thank you very much, Sean.
Stop recording?